Hello, and welcome to the Chain Mountain Podcast. I'm your host, Hank Ackerman. In today's episode, we talk with Justine Franchina. She shares her journey as a COO in the very male dominated chemical industry. We discuss the critical role of safety and understanding your product portfolio's profitability, as well as challenges of implementing effective processes in complex systems like SAP. We also discuss the significance of building trust and seeking feedback to foster collaboration and drive organizational success. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Justine, thank you so much for joining the Chain Mountain podcast today. I wanted to start off with a number, the number 8, and that is the percentage of chemical industry executives that are women, making it one of the most male-dominated industries. Looking back on your career, what were kind of the pivotal moments that shaped your career path all the way from DuPont to C-suite roles, and how has being one of the 8%ers, right? How has that been both a challenge, but also been a motivator for you in your career path?
Yeah, it's amazing. I didn't actually realize that the percentage was quite that small, and so that's kind of interesting. I would say for me, mentorship is probably the most important aspect in early career and then mid and even today. And early on, I had great mentorship from a couple of technical fellows like Charlie Taylor and Pat Fitzgerald in DuPont, and they took the time to engage me fully and allow me to explore all of my ideas and drive the right level of collaboration, which made us hugely successful as a business. And, in addition to that, another mentor of mine, John Waslick down in Memphis, allowed me to challenge status quo in a really safe environment and allowed me to really kind of push the boundaries and kind of come into my own. And I think that really helped me. It helped me learn, in an intense PSM area very early in my career to be able to push and really help the organization grow and develop while not putting anything at risk. Um, as well, for me, I was given a lot of large opportunities and very critical opportunities where I could solve problems that maybe others couldn't. In one case, I was sent over to a European plant site that had been shut down by the government, and I was asked to figure out what had happened, get it back up and running, convince the government that we were in good shape, and then go on my merry way. And I think I only got those opportunities because I was always really open and driving forward. And then I had good mentors that were always backing me up. And that is, I think, really important. And so you really have to be um, able to stand, maybe sometimes alone, and make tough decisions when others may not. And it really allows you to be maybe in that small group of 8% because you're willing to take on some difficult challenges. So for me, mentorship is huge. Gaining as much experience as you possibly can is also really important, fundamentally across as many functions as possible.
Yeah, so that's a great segue into my next question, which is kind of you briefly moved into sales and marketing before returning back to operations. What do you feel that how that experience helped you develop as an executive later in your career, right? And are there other functions that you served in where you said, that helped round me out as a complete athlete, right?
Yeah, and I only spent a couple of years in sales and marketing. It really, though, allowed me to truly understand how important it is that you have the technical understanding and the business understanding coming together. And what I did in that role was I learned how important the customer truly is and that their needs are critical. That being said, they're not so critical you want to do anything silly for your business. So
Right.
fundamentally, you have to figure out how to meet the employees and customers' needs and really drive that business success. And so I had a great opportunity to work with customers, get into their facilities, find out how they used our products, why our products were important, or what issues they had with our products. And then in addition, I was able to spend time on industry councils and really help the industry grow and understand why these types of products were so important. I would say other really important roles for me were around supply chain and quality. I always picked up safety along the way, and we can certainly talk more about that later. But from a quality and sales, excuse me, supply chain standpoint, it was really important as well to learn that, because if you don't really understand how to do production planning, you don't really understand what it takes to have a full comprehensive supply chain, you often are making decisions um, out of either fear or lack of knowledge versus really understanding if A happens, then B happens, and so on and so forth. And the same with quality. You want to make sure that you really understand quality and that you can understand what impacts your quality and what helps you really maintain a high level of quality.
Right.
And that's very important.
Yeah, I'm being a supply chain nerd myself. I love your answer, but well, one of the ways that I always think about supply chain is kind of it's the gray matter in the brain, right? It's not often thought of as its own, or more recently has only been thought of as its own kind of functional area of expertise. But fundamentally, it's that gray matter that sits between, sales and the customer side as well as operations. And I think,
Right.
to be an effective operations executive, you rely on the signals that are provided from supply chain and the ability for supply chain to help, meet the customer needs, on time and full. Um, you bring up an interesting point, I think, around your ability to get in and have conversations with customers. Is that something you continue to do as a COO? Is really be a very customer forward COO later in your career? And is that typical from what you've seen other executives at your level do?
Yeah, it really depends on the situation. I really enjoy the interaction with customers, particularly when they're facing problems, and they deem it to be on the operation side. I like to be able to build that rapport and help them understand that, these are the very critical things that we're doing to support you, and I can be very clear and transparent. Uh, I will say that, sometimes it's not really great to be in front of customers because you really want the CCO and the sales team to really own that relationship. And
Mhm.
so often I'll ask my team and I to pull back to make sure that we are having the right type of relationship. But when there is a real need and technical and operational expertise needs to be brought to bear, I very willingly engage with customers and help them understand where we are and what we're doing to support them.
Right. Okay. No, great. Very, very insightful. You mentioned process safety management, PSM,
Yep.
right, earlier. And
Yeah.
in our previous conversation, you had talked about working at a Memphis cyanide facility, right? And
Right.
cyanide on its faith is kind of has some safety implications, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of exposed you to a very intense environment for process safety management, and I think the chemical industry as a whole has a pretty high correlation linked to process safety lapses, right?
Yeah.
And there's some, when it goes wrong, it can go, horribly wrong. How has that shaped your leadership philosophy, and has that been become ingrained in terms of how you, address your peers on a day-to-day basis, and the people within your organization?
Yeah, so my time in Memphis was really pivotal for my development. I really learned quickly how devastating an accident could be just by running through the drills and hearing
Right,
man down, sent chills through your body, right? Because
right,
you
right,
weren't sure if it was a drill, if it was real, and you knew that everybody had to do everything correctly in order to get that person back. And what it did do for me is it really helped me understand that if you do safety well and you do quality well, everything happens the way it should. And so, following that experience in Memphis, I've really focused on safety and quality. And I've actually been known to be able to support really strong cultural shifts because of my experience in Memphis and also within DuPont as a whole. And I would say that, when I was with DuPont, we had a few fairly significant incidents where people lost their lives or were severely injured. And those have absolutely stuck with me and has caused me to think really hard about how do you respond to a safety incident? How do you train people to take the actions you want them to take when they are in that situation? Because sometimes if it's not ingrained, people will make the wrong decision and sometimes it
Right.
can cost them their lives. So for me, working in Memphis was just phenomenally helpful. And then it has helped me keep that in the forefront in all of my roles.
Yeah. Yeah. A number of the executives that I've had on the podcast before, and kind of throughout my career, kind of have that philosophy of just always lead with safety first, right? Open up a
Yeah,
meeting, talk about safety.
right.
And I think that's a in my mind kind of becomes one of the must-haves in terms of being a C-level executive in manufacturing, right?
Yeah,
Even if you begin to operate, in a corporate environment, right? Still, that I always know who's worked in a plant. I'll give you an instance. I'll always know if they've got 3 points of contact, right? Going down the
yeah,
stairs, right? You
right,
you always can tell immediately if this person knows and has been around a plant just by that
yeah,
that simple
right,
trick, right?
yeah.
Um, so again, kind of going back to the well-rounded executive,
Mhm.
you've obviously been willing to take some risks and go out and do assignments. But in terms of kind of being successful in those roles where you do make a jump and I'm going to take a risk, talk to me a little bit about the how kind of continuing education and curiosity play in part of your ability to not only take the risk but be successful when you do.
Yeah, I would say I've read a lot of books throughout my career, and I've attended a number of different conferences. And I think in each case, I've learned something new because I've been able to have an open mind and a growth mindset. And what I think that really also drives is that you know that you don't know everything. You don't know what you don't know, right? And that continues to drive the level of curiosity that you have. And then you're open to asking questions and you ask those questions. And then that also can help other people be curious too. So as you enter a new role, even an organization that's set in their ways or really comfortable, if you can engage them and have those questioning conversations, that can really help the evolution happen even faster. And that also, though, then drives you to have that ability to find a solution if one needs to be found. And then, as you continue to probe, other folks begin to start looking for solutions versus falling back on, being super comfortable and very um, happy with where they are. And so for me, reading a ton, engaging with people, and really recognizing that there are plenty of things I don't know have helped me maintain my curiosity, but then strive to, in every case when I've joined an organization, what are the critical aspects that I bring, and how can I help that organization evolve to the next level of capability as quickly as possible?
Yeah, I like your answer that there's one part of it that reminds me of a an event that I held in a previous job where we actually had Lego come in and do a leadership exercise. And this exercise was very simple. It was to try to show you that the best way to come up with the kind of the best answer is not to go into a room. So say you have your team and you sit down at your team meeting and you say, here's a problem. What should we do to fix it? Right. And if someone on the team or yourself immediately say, I think we should do this, but definitely not this. You set on an anchor, right? And
Yeah.
everybody builds upon that anchor as being the baseline for, the decision you're about to make. And what they were kind of proposing is to say, all right, here's a problem. Everybody think about it for a second. Then we're going to go around the room and we're going to listen to everybody's answer, right? Individual of their own, not building upon what everybody else thought. Then we're going to go back and say, all right, as a group, what do we think about these answers? Is there a combination of answers that probably is the best one? Is there one that everybody says, oh, that's really actually very brilliant? And intentionally, what you're doing is you're saying there are people who are much more vocal and forward in these instances, and then there's your really really bright ones who don't tend to talk as much, and their ideas kind of never get pulled out. And so the
Yeah.
idea being, if I can extract some of that brilliance of people who are not as forward or willing to kind of throw out their idea in that environment, that ultimately comes up with with the better answer. So a very different way than I know a lot of executives, kind of typically run their meetings. Lego, come to think of it, and this is one of my other questions, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit.
Okay.
Lego also famously used to do a COE and then threw away the COE. They said, you know
Hmm.
what? Having one set of graybeards who's going to go around the world and tell everybody what to do is not the most collaborative way. It's not following in
Right.
that tradition that kind of I talked about. And they had a little bit of a different way where they basically, and I'll let you kind of talk about your philosophy, which is very similar, I think, is kind of let's let the plants decide the best way to do a process. And let's bring all of the plants together
Right.
and let them come up with what it looks like. Tell me a little bit about kind of your thoughts on that and how to derive that, kind of global best practices. So I got 30 plants all over the world. Now I need to come up with, hey, plants, there are certain activities that we need to do in a plant. How do we decide, what is the best practice that we're all going to try to emulate?
Yeah. And I think, you're really correct in, thinking about it in that way, because if you have a really clear understanding of what the needed results are, and they're based on the key performance indices for the business, it then becomes very clear for each function and each site what they bring to that KPI. And you can very easily use KPI flow down. And if you are really clear about what the result is that you're looking for, you can then either appoint strong leaders for the functions and the sites, and then given their knowledge, they can start to drive the right level of standardization. And what they should have in mind, because it's going to be connected to the KPIs, is what benefits the customers and the employees to really drive the right performance in the business. And I find that if you allow people to come together who clearly understand what the results should be,
Right.
they can drive to the right level versus having something put on them and then they have to carry it out. They often can respond negatively because either they didn't think of it, or the folks who are offering the suggestion may not really understand all the aspects of either the function or the site. And that doesn't mean that every site is individual and they can do whatever they want, but they do have to maybe make some shifts in how you might do something. A quality management system comes to mind, right? In some cases, if you have a lot of aerospace products in a site, they're going to deal with their QMS slightly different than a site that doesn't have aerospace. That being said, the fundamental aspects of that QMS, they're there. Everybody treats quality in that same way. And so I think that really helps to drive that performance.
You used the term KPI flow down, right? For those listeners who might not be familiar with that concept, can you maybe just explain what
Sure.
that is and kind of give us a tactical, kind of example of how you use that?
Sure. Yeah. KPI flow down and the way that I've used it in the past is really understanding what your top metrics are for the organization. And often in most chemical companies, it's cost slash profitability, safety and quality and growth. And for me, one of the places that I've really focused in is around the profitability aspect. And if you set the focus on profitability, and you bring that down to the level of the people on the shop floor, you can talk to them about, so how are you yourself impacting cost and thus profitability? And one great example is overtime. And folks, in a lot of cases, are very interested in making money for themselves. And what they're not recognizing is that they're actually causing the business to be less profitable, and truthfully also impacting themselves as an individual because their bonus may not be as high because the profitability of the business is not as high. And so really helping people understand, if you become more capable in your day-to-day work, you actually directly impact the profitability of your company, and you get more time home with your family, you're often healthier, so it's a win-win all around. And so that's kind of a simple KPI flow down that I've used throughout my career.
Yeah, I really like that. And chemicals is kind of notorious for having the 80/20 rule, right? Where it's
Yeah,
20% of my products create, 80% of my profitability. And I think in our previous discussion, you had mentioned you've seen some extreme imbalances there
yeah,
in your career, right?
yeah.
How do you kind of think of how do you think leaders should rethink product rationalization in terms of approaching that profitability question, right? When you say, okay, I've done the basic analysis and I've realized these are dogs and these are the middle performers, right? What's your kind of your mindset and structure and approach for how you kind of improve that the tail end?
Yeah, so I would say really fundamentally, the product life management is critical to any business's success. And, understanding what you just described, what your winners are, what your mid-range guys are, and what your dogs are, because then that can drive the approach that you take to innovate and to rationalize. You should always be bringing in new products and getting rid of those older products. And that should be a cadence. And it should be driven by how easily materials are manufactured, their profitability, the risk with respect to raw material sourcing, and other very good data driven reasons to move products out. And it has to be a consistent process, and all of the functions need to be involved. Sales needs to be involved, procurement needs to be involved, supply chain, focusing on, what your product wheel
Right.
is. If you get a poor running product out, your product wheel is much more streamlined and directly impacts your profitability. In another way as well, if you get to a point where you have a really good and strong product life cycle and you're managing it well, you can enable an even more robust master data architecture. And the way in which your data flows, the level to which you have to keep it up, becomes much more manageable. And for a lot of chemical companies, this is a major issue. And as you go through S4, or excuse me, SAP transformations, it's often a stumbling block for companies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find that you know one of the kind of concepts in basic SNOP, right, historically had been, demand planning, supply planning. Um, there, they've kind of more recently, there was the introduction of the product component, the product review cycle.
Hmm.
And I think that was, more on the CPG side, high volume SKUs, et cetera, et cetera. In my mind and in my experience now, I've seen it become even more and more vital to, chemical companies and, more process-based companies where having an understanding of your products that you're bringing to market becomes more and more important to overall profitability. Um, just in that, if I have a constraint, and especially in chemicals, right, where oftentimes you have continuous manufacturing and I've got to absorb this, fixed overhead, I now need to make sure that I'm running the most profitable products across that asset, right? And
Right.
there's a shift in thinking to margin per minute, right? Versus just straight up margin. And this is an
Right.
old, Eli Goldratt theory, I guess, that came out of, kind of the haystack syndrome, where, if the listeners haven't, read this or understand this theory, and you have assets that are constrained, this is a very important way of thinking and changing your mindset around profitability and where you make your money, against a constrained asset that I might have. So, um, I'm interested to kind of understand a little bit of your, kind of approach to thinking about that profitability, and that it's so focused on the product life cycle, um, but also, how to improve some of those KPIs that you mentioned, like say OEE, right? I know
Hmm.
one of the examples you also used, previously. I think it was at Ketchin, which was a previous company where you were working. You had a boost in OEE by 10%, right? And so, since 1% of an OEE improvement can give you, millions of dollars of recovered profitability, I just wanted to know what were kind of the tactical changes you enacted in order to drive that breakthrough.
Yeah, and the team at Ketchen really clearly understood their processes that they were running, which really facilitated the work that needed to be done. And as an operations team, we focused on the production planning aspect and how the forecasting from sales was coming in. And then we married that with maintenance and reliability. And once we were able to obtain better forecasts and really start taking control over that production planning, we were able to take control of the equipment. And the equipment then was going down when we wanted it to go down versus it was going down because we had run out of material or equipment broke down. And so, because of the great technical understanding of the operations team and the technical team, the process understanding allowed us to quickly execute changes. And we were able to make this improvement in a very short amount of time due to this really great knowledge within the organization and the desire and understanding of taking control of that equipment.
I've never met a sales team who has been readily willing to say, you know what, I have some spare time in my day, and I would love nothing more than to forecast. Can you show me how? It's usually like pulling teeth at the beginning, and then there's an understanding in general of like, yes, okay, I get it, and the
Yeah.
sales managers all of a sudden figure out, hey, this is actually helpful in me managing their performance. Um, what was your secret to getting the sales team to actually give you that forecast, or was that forecast a result of another initiative? And kind of what was your approach there?
Well, I would say that with the entire team at Ketchen, everybody understood that we were working towards profitability. And I think everybody recognized that in order for that to happen, we had to work together. And along this period of time as well, we were also starting to talk about product rationalization. And so there were a number of things that we were starting to think about. And I believe that because of the pace at which the leadership team expected this profitability to come and the pressure on the team, people were very open to understanding, so what can I do as an individual or as a function? We also had some pretty strong sales leaders in the organization, and I think that also helped as well. Probably the most difficult aspect when you think about customer forecast is how good is your relationship with your customer? Do you really understand how they're using your product and why they might not be able to forecast? And is there something that you can do to facilitate that? And sometimes it's holding inventory. Sometimes it's, being able to help them understand what impact they're having on your facility to when they're doing what they are doing. And often customers will say, "Oh my gosh, that's not the impact I want to be having.
Right.
Let's think about, what we can do." But it really comes down to having a really strong sales organization and that really good customer relationship.
Yeah, I think I just think back to, when I started in my supply chain career, how far it's come in terms of our general understanding of the number of available models and strategies that I can deploy
Mm,
based on the situation, right? And I think, for the most part, that's where there's oftentimes a disconnect between the customer and sales as to, you know, you need a certain service, right? And you need to meet me to meet you in a place where we can collaborate.
hmm.
I feel like the Walmart mentality took over a lot of companies, and they were like, "You as a supplier, I'm going to bring you in. I'm going to put you under, in a dark room with a single spotlight. And I'm going to interrogate you and hook you up to machine, and you're going to give me a better price." And that drove a lot of kind of the old collaborative forecasting and planning concepts away. And then periods were kind of like like a pendulum, right? It's like all of a
Right.
sudden we beat up all our suppliers, and then it swings back the other way, and now we need to collaborate with them, right? And you're constantly swinging back and forth. But fundamentally, whenever I sit down with a client who's having those service issues, there's inevitably a lack of an ability to identify the specific strategies associated with the product that I'm serving, right? And
Yeah.
typically it's kind of like, well, we do this and this is our thinking, and so therefore, these are the conditions under which I have chosen to, stock finished goods or stock a raw material and then produce it quickly, right? Whatever that supply chain model might be. And it ends up being more of a one size fits all. Whereas if you do what you're suggesting, which I think listening to the client or listening to having a conversation with the customer and saying, here's how we operate. We want to work well with you, but we need a forecast. We need to think about, is vendor managed inventory the right answer? Is,
Right.
us putting it closer than, finished good inventory? But if that's the case, we need to have a commitment on volume, right? So
Right.
all of those things now, I feel like a lot of those have been flushed out, and there's a bunch of models that we can pick from.
Hmm.
But for some reason, companies are just now kind of cottoning on to, how that's done and how that needs to be done. And then the other problem where companies are having this issue, I think, is fundamentally I can come up with that strategy, but how do I get my system to execute it, right?
Yeah.
And that I want to take. I'm making a slow move to a different discussion point, but one of I work with SAP a lot, right?
Hmm.
And that is one of the issues that I bump into all the time with clients whose SAP isn't working correctly, right? Is the need to be able to define, how you deliver value to a client, and, create a set of processes that ultimately deliver that. And SAP is very, very specific, right? It must be, it's German, right? So it must be exactly this way, right? And, if it's not done exactly that way, and there's not a really clear process definition and the data doesn't work, then it becomes really, really cumbersome. I know you've had your fair share of challenges with SAP implementation. So maybe just if you don't mind, kind of tell me a little bit about your experience and what you learned as a leader trying to take a company through that transition.
Yeah, I would say that, most recently I experienced a transition from ECC to S4 that did not go well. And what I realized is that we didn't understand our processes or the automation that we were actually utilizing in ECC well enough. In addition to that, our master data knowledge wasn't strong enough. So when you have those gaps, you don't end up really understanding what the system is actually doing for you. In addition, we actually had a couple of critical fields set up incorrectly, and we didn't realize this until several weeks in. So, as I relive that and relive other experiences, I would advise companies to really take their time and truly understand their original processes and then their new processes, so that understanding of what the person sitting at the computer and in the function is actually doing. And one of the biggest mistakes that I've seen happen, and this has been several times now, is IT owns the project
Yeah.
because it's a system. But
Yes.
fundamentally, operations pays and commercial pays for the inadequacies of that system. So I
Right.
would say that if I were ever to do that again, I would ask that operations own the project, with strong collaboration from IT and commercial,
Yeah.
obviously, but that knowledge of the process really has to be there. The really clear understanding of the tasks being carried out really need to be well understood.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are a number of tremendous points in there. I think, I see, customers over and over kind of shortcutting the whole process side,
Yeah.
or there's an integrator who makes you believe that,
Yes.
no, standard SAP process, right? It's going to be fine.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
Yep.
there's a nuance to S4 and the transition to cloud that's a little bit different in that, your ability to customize changes dramatically, right? And so, if SAP, has that functionality, or if you're asking SAP to do that, that becomes a very different level of lift and cost. But also fundamentally, um, because of the customizations you've made in your legacy, right? What are you sacrificing? Now you're going to go and just follow the standard SAP process. I think your point about, what does the person do in their chair? How does that impact, the how the system needs to be configured? And then I also find that just a lot of architects who are the ones that ultimately are deciding, what switches to flip in the configuration, um, don't always take the time to really truly understand what your business process is, right? And
Right.
nor can the business articulate it, right? And
Right.
that's where you kind of kind of always fall off the rails. And then there's the obviously the capex part too, right? It's I'm going to set aside so many millions of dollars. Right. I only set aside 10 and I realize the project's going to cost 11. Where am I going to save some money? Well, I'm going to cut OCM, right?
Right.
That's the first one that goes, right? Then I'm going to cut the process work, right? I'm going to cut all these ancillary things. But no one's ever going to cut that, kind of the core, implementation services, but
Yeah.
always a pretty painful, pretty painful experience. And the stat I have along with this is kind of like only 35% of the S4 HANA projects are delivered on time and on budget.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a part of me, right, that's like, wow, that feels high, right?
Yeah.
I really have yet to run into one that's close to meeting that threshold.
Yeah.
Um, you also brought up, briefly there about your relationship both with the customers and being able to talk maybe about the other kind of emotional connections you've met with just your internal leaders, right? So your
Mm-hmm.
ability to work with the other CCO, with IT, those types of things, and kind of talk about maybe kind of what your philosophy is there and what tricks have you learned that are the most effective.
Yeah, it is interesting. When stress is high, I tend to take different tactics versus when they're low. One of the practices that I have used throughout my career is radical candor. And Scott wrote a great book, talking about really being interested in how you're coming across, and then also really being interested in helping others to develop. And it's all through feedback. And, one of the critical aspects for me has been as I'm driving that collaboration between functions and with other leaders or with other counterparts, it's really about, so what are we trying to accomplish? And another favorite book of mine is Switch, and it's a little
Yeah.
teeny tiny person sitting on an elephant, right? And
Yeah.
often that elephant, that level of emotion, is what drives a lot of our actions. So you have to think really closely about, so how do you have the right environment so that you do get the right outcome that you're looking for, using some data, right? Because you need to guide, but not only thinking about data. And truthfully, that's one of the areas I struggle with. I love data. And so I tend to talk a lot about, well, these are the results we're looking for. This is the data that tells us that. And so there's always an opportunity to really make it about I'm trying to help you. I really want you to be successful, and I want us as a business to be successful. And so that only happens if we all work together. And so that community and alignment of what we're trying to aspire to for our customers and for our employees is often what I'll rely on, is that everybody wants to do the right thing by their employees, everybody wants to do the right thing by their customer. And so let's talk about what that looks like then, and how can we do that together.
You use the term radical candor, right?
Hmm.
And I think, and then you kind of followed that up by saying, you know, we have to have a feedback loop to be able to understand, was the radical candor that I provided you, did you take that well, or did I come
Right.
across? Tell me just specifically, like, how do you do that follow up, right? How do you, in a board meeting or an executive meeting, and you go through and you provide radical candor, say to one of your colleagues in the business. Um, how do you kind of query I hope I wasn't too mean to you, right? Like, what's your style in that regard?
So often I spend a lot of time working with folks in one-on-ones meetings. So, if we had maybe a tough discussion either in public or even in a small group, I will often connect with that person as soon as possible, as soon as it makes sense. Hopefully face to face and not an email, and really talking about what my intent was and helping them understand where I'm coming from, particularly if maybe they haven't absorbed it in the way that I had hoped. Often, though, what I'll do is I will ask for feedback, and I'll ask for folks to give me feedback because feedback's a gift. You don't always have to take it, people say, but fundamentally, mulling it around in your head, right? Really saying, gosh, okay, well, I've gotten this feedback. There's a reason for that. So it's really important that I at least pay attention to what's been said and how it's been said, so that, I can also share in this radical candor. And I find that if you're willing to take feedback and have that difficult conversation, folks are much more open to your giving them feedback. But feedback is tough. If you don't have the right culture, if that feedback has never been there before, it almost doesn't matter how you give it. And you often have just multiple difficult conversations because people aren't prepared. And it's funny because I appreciate feedback. Um, but I think sometimes people don't take you seriously. They're just like, "Oh, you're just trying to do that, so I'm not mad that you've given me feedback." And you really have to hit that right level in your culture and get to a point. And leadership owns that, right? Leadership
Right.
has to be willing to take feedback and then also have some of that really good conversation so that everybody's prepared to have that conversation. That's a tough road in probably every single business I've ever been in. That feedback is tough to get to work. It takes a lot of time. And sometimes, I struggle with that because I'm not very patient. And so you have to remember, right? You meet people where they are, and then you help them shift slowly but surely to that next place where they're going to be ready for that feedback.
Yeah, and I think in a global business, there's additional challenges, right? So
Absolutely.
one of my favorites is like in Korea, right? I worked a lot with the Koreans, and it's kind of like there's a very hierarchical society, right? And you will, if someone's more senior than you, they'll never give you any feedback until you go to the Korean barbecue and have a whole bunch of shoju and everybody's drunk, and then they'll tell you exactly what they think of you, right? Um, you know, so, in one sense, it's a very defined feedback forum, right?
Right.
So you know exactly what you're going to get, right? But culturally, that becomes a nuance that I guess, and as an executive, you have to pick up on those nuances and learn how to
No,
adapt to those different formats of feedback based upon the kind of cultural context that you're in, right? Have you found that to
no.
be true as well? And kind of having the challenges of dealing with plant managers in different countries and that type of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting for me as I work with folks in Europe, particularly in the Netherlands and Germany, how hierarchical they are and regimented. Sometimes they didn't feel like they had to take that feedback. And sometimes I think they didn't recognize how beneficial it was. And versus Asia or India, though they would respond always in the right way, they may or may not be taking your feedback. But in some cases, it wasn't because they didn't want to, it was almost foreign to get that direct feedback. And so I would go after it a couple of different times. And when I did that, the return was fantastic because it sunk in and they recognized that, where it was coming from, why the feedback was being given, and took it to heart and really made the changes very quickly. So, absolutely, culturally, it can have a huge difference. Fundamentally, for me, in thinking about my career, when I'd worked with some of my teams in Brazil, for example, they took every speck of feedback as soon as you gave it and made the change. And it was at some points a little bit startling how quickly they did and would make the change. And I realized at the time they had a very strong leader who was super transparent. And because she was willing to take feedback and engage with them, they were then as well. And it was fantastic. And I really enjoyed that with respect to that culture in Brazil.
Yeah, and we're talking a lot about how we deliver feedback. Like one of the toughest things to do as an executive is go seek feedback too, right?
Hmm.
And that's all the way from, asking for people to do a 360 and those types of things. I think the further on you get in your career and the more kind of mastery and command you have in your particular area, becomes something, potentially that executives do less and less.
Yeah.
Um, in your mind's eye, how do you go about asking for that? And as an executive, as you kind of moved up, how have you learned is the best way to be able to kind of seek out the feedback that can be really productive for you?
Yeah, probably most recently, the best example I can give is when I was with Green Tweed. I sat with my team and we actually did a trust exercise. We talked about what trust meant and why we trusted somebody and why we didn't trust somebody. And then we started talking very specifically about so what does that look like then? What behavior do you see when you trust somebody? And what behavior do you need to see in order to trust somebody? And what we were able to do is set up um, a space where everybody was comfortable, and I was able to talk about, so what can I either start doing or stop doing that will allow you to trust me more. And we ended up having just some phenomenal conversations, and then it also allowed for me to give feedback, but not so directly this time,
Right.
right? It's one of those give and take. And so I, took a lot and from a standpoint of the feedback standpoint, and then I gave a little bit. And the relationship with that team shifted tremendously because everybody recognized that I was open for feedback and I was serious about being open for feedback because I had tried it a
Yeah.
couple of times but it had never sunk in. Granted, it was on a Teams call versus this case, it was all face to face.
Right.
And I think people internalize what you're sharing with them much more when you're face to face. And I think it's much more believable in that venue.
Right. Well, I can't believe it, but we have flown through our time together, and
Wow.
it's
Okay.
been really, really a great conversation. And I've got probably about six or seven more questions that I was hoping to answer or to ask you and get answers for. But it's been a tremendous honor to have you on the podcast, and I hope in the not too distant future we can get you back and I can finish all those questions. But in the meantime, thank you very much for everything, Justine, and best of luck in your next adventure.
Great. Thank you so much, Hank.